hope you'll enjoy your trip back in time. It will be different from last time. We have some same speakers, but they all are working on new topics. The advisory board, that's Dave Berth, Ingrid Koszelski, Joan Piasecki, Elaine Pinter, Marianne Pasakowski, Dave Wingenfeld, and I are still continuing to collect photos and verbal histories for the book that we hope to print for our anniversary year of the history of Valley View. Don't be afraid if it's just a verbal story you want to enter, because we will record it or write it down so that we can put it into our booklet. As you're taking your seats, you may have seen the film that's been on our screen here. It is running thanks to the work of Earl and Sue Foote. The film is theirs. It shows farming in Valley View during the 1930s and 40s, and also some of the construction of the Cuyahoga Heights school system, which we were very instrumental in forming. Tonight we have invited 4 speakers to guide us through Valley View's richest history. Our first speaker is Dave Wingenfeld. Dave is the owner and operator of a successful farm. He also is our host and manager of the Big Red Barn. Tonight, he will be speaking on the early Moravian settlement that was in Valley View. Our second speaker will be Frank Goslin, and he spoke to us last time, but this time he is looking into the earliest history we have on Valley View, starting from its roots in Europe to the early 1900s. He is a retired history teacher, and is one of the most valuable resources that the advisory committee has. We will be having a short intermission after Mr. Goslin, and you can stretch your legs, maybe get a bottle of water. You also may want to wish. We have 2 people who are spending their birthday with us. One is Carol Robinson Patterson, and the other one is Elaine Pinter. And they are both celebrating their birthday with us, which I think is very nice. And when we resume our program, we have 2 more speakers. I know we have 1 speaker. I'm not sure if our second speaker is going to make it in time or not, because he had another commitment. But Paul Poyman will be talking about the Wilson Alexander Mill. Actually, the Alexander Mill was built by the Alexander family. And he has a historical account that was written by Lynn Jones, and her husband is a direct descendant of the Alexander family. And they owned and operated that until they sold it to the Wilson family. And we had planned on having Skip Wilson talk about that, but we'll see if he makes it here. If not, we'll open it up for questions. And I'm hoping that you all have a great night with us. We couldn't want for better weather. It's not as hot as we had you last year, so it's a little nicer. So let's begin our journey back with Dave Wingenfeld, and he will take us through the earliest settlement in Valley View.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the barn. The Gleason barn was owned by the original owners of this farm was the Gleason family. Going back to early 1800s, their descendants were the Careys, and eventually the Speets owned it. So it was the same family, same descendants, until the Cuyahoga Valley National Park bought this farm. And I'd also like to recognize Earl Foote and Sue Foote. Bill Spieth and Bill and Dave Spieth. Their uncle was the last operator of this farm. And then there's also Joyce Weesey, who, believe it or not, as a teenager, worked on this farm also. So she has a lot of good memories. I'm going to be talking about Pilgaroo. Has anybody ever heard of Pilgaroo? A couple people? Okay, how about Schoenbrunn Village? Gannat and Hutton? So, the first permanent settlement in the Cleveland area was Pilgaroo, and it was located in this area. And it was established by the Moravian missionaries. Now, who are the Moravians? The Moravians are one of the oldest Protestant denominations in the world, and they have a long history of missionary work. They came from Moravia, which was a country in what is now the Czech Republic. The Moravians came to America in 1735, and they settled in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1741. There are 60,000 Moravians still in our country. Missionary work is still their calling, resulting in most of them being in third world countries. And there's probably almost 1 million Moravians in the world. So the Moravians established Gannat and Hutton in 1781, which is close to New Philadelphia, Dover area. And they converted some of the local Indians to Christianity. And the British and hostile Indians actually captured them and moved them from the area because they wanted that land, and they did not like the converted Christians. They didn't like the Americans. So the next year, they actually massacred 90 of them, the British and their Indian allies. So David Zeisberger and John Heckwelder, who are the two main missionaries, took the remaining converts near Detroit, and they lived up there until 1786. Well, they were told in February of 1786 it was safe to move back to Gannat and Hutton. So they left Detroit by vessel. They made it to Sandusky Bay, and then they were put ashore, and they continue on by foot in canoes to the mouth of Cuyahoga River. And their aim was to get back to Gannat and Hutton. It was getting late, spring was passing, it was almost maybe May, and they decided they were following the Indian trails along the Cuyahoga River, and they made it about 10 to 12 miles south of Lake Erie, where they found an old Ottawa settlement. As they had a food shortage, they decided to stop and make a permanent settlement right here in this area. And they found an old field by the river, and they planted corn, potatoes, beans, pumpkins, and turnips. Now, this is the number one site that they suspect was Pilgaroo, which is, this is Canal Road, the river, Tippett Street Road, and Tippett Street. So, 1, 2, for 2 and 3, there were 3 different spots where people suspect Pilgrim was located. And they built 28 structures on the highland above the river where the Ottawa village was. Most of our information comes from maps and diaries from David Zeisberger and John Heckwalder, but no definite measurements of where it was. In the diaries, they mentioned Tinker's Creek, they mentioned the river. That's where they said it was. So it's in dispute, even to this day, where it was. So getting back to the Pilgrim, 1786 is when they settled here. And later that summer, there were huge pack trains traveling from Pittsburgh to Lake Erie. And they would follow the Indian Trail, and they would go past Pilgrim. And when they did, they would drop off supplies and news of what was going on in the country. David Zeisberger thought they were safe from strife between the U.S. and the hostiles. But in March of 1787, they were informed that the U.S. wanted to build a fort at the mouth of the Kaga River. So acting on past experiences with ill-disciplined frontier soldiers, they decided to leave Pilgrim because they felt the same thing was going to happen. They were going to be chased out or massacred. So in April, they headed west, settling in the Huron River area. Now, one question I have is, why would they convert to Christianity? Because as converts, they paid a high price. They gave up their beliefs, they gave up their traditions. But some people think they did it because they felt protected from the British soldiers, the hostiles, and marauding whites. So our next speaker will be Frank Goslar. I'm going to put these pictures in this model on the side if you want to look at it.
Thanks again, Dave. I'm going to follow up with Dave's presentation. And we're going to talk about the early history of this area starting in 1662, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the settlers that came here, the American settlers from the colonies. Just to say a little bit more about myself before I get started. I grew up here in Valley View on Hathaway Road. My father, Ed Goslin, grew up right here at the end of Tinker's Creek Road, across from Tink's Tavern. My mother, Janice Albrecht, grew up on Canal Road, in between Hathaway and Hillside. And my grandfather, I actually graduated from Cauga Heights in 1971, and I was on the Valley View Fire Department, EMT, during the 1970s. I served 20 years in the Navy and retired in 1996, and then came back to live here in this area and started to work for Cleveland Public Schools as history teacher in 1998. After completing 20 years in the Navy. I live, since 2007, I live with my lovely wife, Jacqueline, who's here, and live on Hathaway today in the family home that I grew up in. My sister Jackie is here as well. We were in that home since 1962. I retired from Cleveland Public Schools in 2013. My wife and I have 4 adult children and 10 grandchildren. So just to give you a little bit. Okay, let's go to the next photo, please. All right, I'm going to start, we're going to go back to the beginning here. The village of Valley View occupies a tiny section of what the early colonists called unexplored Indian lands. Valley View was part of those Indian lands claimed for France by French missionaries and fur traders. Matter of fact, a fur trading post called the French House was located at Tinker's Creek in the Coggan River, right over here in the early 1700s. And as you can see, this map displays Coggan County and Valley View County in red. Next photo, please. King Charles II is pictured here, son of King Charles I. He returned from exile and became King of England in 1660 after Oliver Cromwell actually had his father executed, Charles I. Okay? Oliver Cromwell actually ruled England as a protectorate from 1653 to 1658 after defeating Charles II's father. Now, Charles II fled to Scotland and became King of Scotland and actually fought Oliver Cromwell's armies as well, but his forces were defeated and he escaped to mainland Europe where he stayed in exile. But after Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, Charles II, pictured here, was invited back to England and took over as King of England. Now, starting in 1660, or 1662, he actually granted a royal grant and signed over to the colony of Connecticut a portion of land called the Western Reserve. Now, in this picture here, this section of land right here, which is called the Western Reserve, this was actually given to the colony of Connecticut by King Charles II. And their intention was to try to settle this area. If we could switch to the next picture, please. Now, Great Britain and the French crown disputed this area for a number of years. This region that they disputed was called the Northwest Territory. France had originally claimed this area along with their settlements in Canada, and they had sent in French missionaries and French fur traders that worked together with the native tribes for a number of years in the 1600s. Of course, Great Britain, having its colonies on the coast, they were competing for this area as well. And this eventually led to the French-Indian Wars, which they also called the 7 Years' Wars in Europe at the time. Okay. If we could switch to number 5, please. It was about 100 years later, with the Treaty of 1763, that actually ended the French-Indian Wars. France was defeated and basically ceded or gave up its interest to King George III of England. After Britain gained control of this area, its attempts to reserve the territory for the use by Native Americans roused resentment among the British colonists, who were already seeking to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The 13 colonies were trying to expand to this area, and of course King George III wanted to reserve it for the Native Indians and keep control of it by the British Empire. There was a number of other things that led to the war as well, but this was one of the things that angered the colonists. If we could switch to the next picture, please. So the Civil War, the American Revolution broke out. In 1776, we declared our independence, and we fought the British, of course. And by 1783, the American Revolution was over, and the English had ceded or gave up all its rights to the North American territories to the new 13 states. This is a picture of some of the battles that were fought by the American revolutionaries under George Washington. Now, starting in 1783, we can switch to the next photo, please. Yeah, this is similar to the one that was just up there a minute ago. In 1783, when Great Britain gave up its territories and the 13 colonies became 13 states, most of the states or the colonies lost their areas to the federal government, which was part of the Northwest Territory. Connecticut, which had been given this area under a royal grant by King Charles II, they were allowed to keep this area. All right, and so as a result, Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, actually sold this area of land called the Western Reserve to 57 private investors. They paid $1.2 million to the state of Connecticut for this land. And as a result, they set up the Connecticut Land Company in September 5th, 1795. This area that they had bought was a total of 3 million acres. So they were planning on sending surveyors in, dividing it up, and selling it to settlers, American settlers, after 1795. All right. In 1796, a year later, a party of 52 persons, including surveyors, boatsmen, astronomers, commissary, and physicians, led by Moses Cleveland, agent for the Connecticut Land Company that these 57 men and investors had formed, started out for the Western Reserve. This was mainly to divide the area into townships, each 5 miles square. Okay, so Moses Cleveland arrived there in Cleveland, at the mouth of the Cog River, and they basically were going to divide this entire area east of the Cog River into 5 mile square township. They couldn't actually survey the western areas west of the Cog River because these areas were still claimed by Indians. The earlier treaty, the Indians in this eastern area gave up their rights in the earlier treaty a few years earlier. We could switch to the next one, please. Here's the picture of Moses Cleveland. This one is a picture of 1885. Next picture, please. Now this particular map, dated 1796, actually shows the areas east of the Cuyahoga River, and these squares are all 5 mile squares of different townships. Now this particular area I highlighted is the area that includes Valley View. It doesn't come out very good on this particular projector, but I drew a red line around the area that they surveyed. This area right here hadn't been surveyed yet due to the Indian claims, but this square box would become 2 years later the Independence Township in 1798. Okay? Now, unfortunately, even though Moses Cleveland came in and surveyed these areas and made it ready for American families to move across and buy these sections of land, we still had the British that felt that they were in control of this area. They were still disputing control of this area. Because you got to remember, the British gave up the 13 colonies, which became Confederation states, but they really weren't willing to give up this area that they had won from France in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 or whatever. So this eventually led to another war, the War of 1812. You want to switch to the next picture, please? Oh, I think we went too far. Okay. No, okay, that's the correct one. Well, so, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before that war actually broke out again with Britain, we see some of the earliest families start to settle this area. Actually, after the 1800s, starting around 1810, 1812. And I've actually, some of the first settlers, I brought up a map. This map, I think, is 1914, shows Stinkers Creek here in red. And some of the different people are listed here, such as Christian Green had a number of, he was one of the early settlers that had a number of, his family had a number of sections of plots here along Stinkers Creek. And some of the other early families that settled with the Comstocks, the Christian Greens, as mentioned earlier, Samuel Wood, Lewis Johnson, all settled in these areas. Other settlers include the Chases, the Gallettes, the Manns, the Mikens, the Mortons, William Moses family, Hungerfords, and the Tumans, basically settled in this area of what was then Independence Township. Okay, now we'll go to the next slide, please. Even though we had some American settlers moving into this area after 1800, we still had conflicts of interest with Great Britain, who still was trying to control this area, and this eventually led to the War of 1812, together with other disputes over other areas of the new 13 colonies. And some of the battles were fought in this area, including even George Washington at age 22 had fought early years to drive the French out. Oliver Hazard Perry is pictured here in the Battle of Lake Erie, and we actually ended the War of 1812 in a draw with Great Britain. Neither side actually won, but after the War of 1812, the British pulled out all their people from the Northwest Territory, including the Western Reserve and Ohio areas, and at that time it was finally secured for American settlers. So go to the next picture, please. Matter of fact, there's some record of some of the early settlers that did come after 1800 and actually fought for the Americans on this American side in the 1812 war with Great Britain. Now here, starting around 1860, I'm showing the Hathaway Road, Schreiber Road area, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the early families that came to this area. In 1816, Zephaniah Hathaway and his wife Silence, who came from Vermont, settled on Turney Road at Hathaway. Hathaway Road was named after Zephaniah Hathaway. Zephaniah died at age 93 in 1860 and was buried in the Village Hillside Cemetery right up above. Another family, early settlers, was Yeaman Campbell from Connecticut. He cleared 50 acres of land and built a cabin on Hathaway Road near the old Jesse Gillette Lang house, which is right across from Eve Avenue. His family members were also buried in the Village Hillside Cemetery. And he later, his family later built a house further down on Hathaway as well. You can see here, this is the upper part of Hathaway. You see the Hathaway family. Here you see across from Eve Avenue is the native family. We probably cleared most of this area here. We talk about 350 acres of land. That's probably what they cleared. Some of the other early settlers you see in this area is Walters had this area. Right at the corner, now we see Edgar, the Edmund farm, or Edmund farm, he had land there as well. We see the Gleasons had a certain area of land. And then moving on to Shriver Road, you see the Shriver family as well. We have also in this area the Kellogg's, the Edgars, as mentioned earlier, Walters. Now up on Shriver, we had the Edwin Shriver, settled and farmed the land on Shriver Road, which they named the road after the Shriver family. The Boning family settled, farmed this area as well. Here we can see the Boning family, all Shriver. Okay. So we see some of the earliest people that settled the central part of Valley View here. Can we switch to photo 13, please? Here's an old photograph that people have seen before, I'm sure, of Western Party or popular among the farmers pictured above is a group of Ernest Boning Farm and Shriver Road. Not a very good photograph, but just wanted to give you an idea of what it looked like back then. Next picture, please. Here we have a picture of some of the families, these very early settlers I just talked about, the Comstocks, the Manns, Hathaways, the Campbells. They're actually buried in the cemetery up here. This is an earlier picture, probably maybe the 90s. And we see this is the Campbell headstone, still standing. Unfortunately, it's not over now. But I listed some of the, I've actually went up there last year, took some pictures and listed some of the stones that are up there and the people's names and years of died area. Fish, Comstock, 1810, and Lanning, 1877, we had Sally, Truman, 1828, Anna, Man, 1837. We have a stone up there, Jeff Moses, 1844, Julie Campbell, 1860, John Knight, 1865, and Calvin Collette, 1912. Just some of the many stones that are up there right here on the hill. It's really a shame how it's been vandalized over the years, and I think the Valley View Historical Society is trying to arrange to have this area protected better. Okay. Moving on to the next photograph. Now on the north end, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the families that settled in the northern end of Valley View and also Central Canal Road. We have the Fosdicks, the Greens, the Foots, the Heintons, the Baileys, the McMillans, and the Gleasons, all settled from the northern end on down to the Central Park along the Canal Road area. Matter of fact, we have a William Green who lived in Brecksville, actually purchased a portion of the Fosdick land in 1817. We had the Fosdick family living up on the hill near where 480 Bridge is now, and they actually built a sandstone structure that I'll talk about in a minute here, but the William Green's daughter, Emily Green, actually married one of the Fosdick boys and lived in that sandstone structure. We also had some other settlers, the Paynes, the Cochrans, and the Brockmans as well. Basically in this area right here. Okay, if we can go to the next picture, please. In 1816, we had the John Harper family built a house on Old Rockside Road near Canal Road, and it was later torn down in 1950. This picture here Now in 1826, we had Stephen Freese built a brick house near Sagamore Creek on Canal Road, and he started farming the surrounding land. Of course, that's down at the very end of the village here in South. Okay, that was actually about a year before this section of the canal opened. The Frazee house was actually built, and he was farming the land in that area. Next picture, please. Now, starting in this same period, in the early 1800s, Valley View area prospered as an agricultural community. Residents were also contracted to construct and maintain the Ohio Erie Canal. Here we have a picture that kind of displays how this is an agricultural community. This is the William Knoll farm on the hill, looking from Hathaway behind the police station, looking down Canal Road and Hillside Road back in distance. This was the William Knoll farm. This is the Valley Inn, which we'll talk about a little further here in a minute. Now, a lot of the farmers were in agriculture and selling their crops to local markets, but starting in 1825, when they started constructing canals in here, they brought Irish and German immigrants in to dig the canal, but they needed support from the local farmers for supplies, food, products, dairy, and so forth. So, like I say, a lot of the locals were contracted to help in the building of the canal. Next photo, please. Here we see the opening of this section from Akron to Cleveland in 1827. On the 4th of July, 1827, it began a new era of transportation. This is actually a picture of the mill in 1890. Okay, when it was, at that point, I think it was owned by Mr. Foster, but it was originally the Alexander Mill. Okay, if we go to the next picture, please. In 1836, William Knapp built a house on Canal Road across from Hillside Road. Here we see a 1930 photograph of William Knapp house. This structure still stands across from Hillside Road. William Knapp was very involved in the community. He served as a postal person, as a school teacher. I think he was on a lot of important positions in local area management. So he was a well-known figure at that time as well. Next picture, please. Here we see a picture of the Alexander Brothers mill that they built. Starting sometime after 1840, the Alexander Brothers, who lived up on Dunham Road, they constructed a sawmill down here at Sagamore Creek and started to log out the area and use the timbers and saw them up to construct a mill that at Alexander and Canal. And this is a 1915 picture, I believe, of the mill. Next picture, please. After 1850, canal use and maintenance declined as railroad mileage increased. Here we see an 1887 picture of the Valley Railroad train is shown. It was around 1880 that the Valley rail line came into service. So this started to make it a lot easier for goods and services to be transported. Because keep in mind, during the winter, the canal was froze and most transportation had to stop on the canal in the winter. So this was a big improvement starting around 1880. Okay, next picture, please. In 1853, this is the Hillside building structure that was originally owned by Moses Gleason. Well, a relative, Isaac Gleason, inherited the building, and in 1853 the size was doubled, okay, from what it originally was. This is an 1898 photo. As you can see, this was the original Also, if we go to the next picture, around that same year, we see that the Alexander Mill now is completed and is in service, it's operational. It was later sold, roughly around 25 years later, to Mr. Foster, and its name remained the Alexander Mill. But then 25 years after that, around the turn of the century, it was sold to a Thomas Wilson Sr., who of course changed its name to the Wilson's Feed Mill. Next picture, please. Well, that was, by the way, that picture, last picture, was a 1915 photo. Here we see in 1854, a year later, the house here on the corner of Tinkers Creek Canal, and it was referred to as the Edmund Gleason House. Gleason family was on record as being the first people to live in the new structure. And it later became the Carey home when one of the Gleason girls married a Carey boy. Okay? There is some early records that indicate that the home was actually built by Sally Fisher, even though its first residence was Edmund Gleason in 1854. Okay, so this picture is actually 1854. Next picture, please. Sometime around 1869, you see the Campbell family that lived down by the Lang family area. They actually built a home across from the town hall, just down a little ways. It still stands today. The Campbell House, okay? Next picture, please. Around 1872, Ohio transferred ownership of 3 miles of the canal, starting at the terminus in the city of Cleveland. And this section further south of that 3-mile section that runs south through Valley View was maintained for industrial use of its water. Of course, you know, for years the water from the canal was feeding steel mills. So this section became basically a recreational area and became the early beginnings of the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. Okay, here you see, this is mile lock 11 down by where the boathouse used to be. You see a couple of people leisurely going on the canal. Here is the old boathouse shown behind. So this is 11 Mile Walk down there behind the boathouse. My light's fading, so it's getting a little harder to read, so bear with me. All right, starting around 1880, we go to the next picture, please. Oh, before we'll stay on this, before I actually talk about 1880. I brought this map up too to show you Independence Township around this period. You'll notice from the previous map, now this area is today, and Independence Township actually included both sides of the river, east side and the west side. This map here is actually 1874, I believe. Okay? Now if we go to the next picture, please. All right. We see here 1880, the Valley Railway from Cleveland to Canton began operation. It was controlled by the B&O Railroad starting in 1890 with 4 passenger trains each day until 1934 when it was switched to freight services only until its last run in 1962. We see in this picture here the South Park Terminal at Stone Road, opened in 1909 and was closed in 1962. So this is South Park Terminal. that's actually on the Independence side of the railroad tracks at Stone Road. So its last run, like I say, was around 1909, and then ran to about 1962. Okay, if we can go to the next picture, please. All right, on March 22nd, 1919, a detachment of territory to be known as the Township of Southview was approved by the County Commissioners. On 10 June, a new village council was approved with Fort C. Allen as mayor for Southview. The new official name of Valley View Village was proposed by Arthur Lyman, Sr., that's him there, and it was quickly adopted by the newly formed council. So here we see the finally South Independence Township going, this area going from Independence Township to Newburgh Hamlet to South Newburgh Township, and now finally to Valley View. Next picture, please. Now, even though we became Valley View, oh, yeah, that's fine. Even though we became Valley View, that building was still being used as a school. And in 1924, I've got an article here that was cut out of the paper. One of the pupils of that school, Frank Engling, his parents owned the Valley Inn. He wrote an essay and was entered in the Women's Christian Temperance Union essay for the state of Ohio, and he won first place. He wrote an essay on evils of tobacco, and it was kind of ironic because Frank Engling, who later changed his name to Frank Albrecht, was a heavy smoker for most of his adult life. But needless to say, now interesting too, it says here that Frank attended, this is 1924, attended Pleasant Valley School, which was the town hall, and he resided at Brooklyn Station. See, so anyone living on Canal Road, their postal address was Brooklyn Station. Next picture, please. Here is the 1924 class out in front of the town hall. Frank Albrecht wrote this, that's him right there. Next picture, please. And that pretty much concludes my presentation. For anybody that wants more information, I created a website several years ago. It's called valleyviewhistory.com, and you can go to this website for additional pictures and information. But I thank you for your time and appreciate your patience. Does anybody have any questions before the break? Then, if not, we'll take a break. Thank you.
These are from Lynn. She wants them to be compliments of the Bedford Historical Society, which she and I both represent, and neighbors to the Valley View Historical Society. These are, this represents a These represent a checklist which you would, any householder, housewife, or anyone who does laundry well over 100 years ago, they would follow. And note that as you read this, you'll see, wait a minute, that's not spelled right. Well, this is original spelling of the period. Real frontier spelling. Well, anyway, the Alexander Mill was built sometime in maybe around 1853, but it was fully up and running by 1855. It was built by Andrew Alexander and his brother Robert. Andrew bought out his brother in 1860 for $3,000. Now, I looked it up, and apparently $3,000 in 1860 is worth about $88,000 in 2016. So roughly 30 times. This is the Alexander Mill is on lock, what we know as Lock 37 on the Ohio and Erie Canal. Now it was a very important, as the canal was, and all these little mills along the way and stops and so forth, very important to local industry, agriculture being a big part of that. Because you could take goods now from, as was mentioned, it went from Cleveland to the Ohio River, but it also went from Cleveland to all the way across New York State. So you had huge economic advantages moving goods and so forth, and people, freight and so forth. A typical canal boat would have a payload of maybe 80 tons. So you can just imagine corn, wheat, rum, people, lots of different lumber to build things. The previous speaker mentioned the building of a house somewhere, and a sawmill. And so some of the logs from that sawmill built, as I understand it from Lynn, built a house that Arthur Alexander lived in while he owned the mill. Now, he was not a miller, he was a businessman. And he would hire millers who would actually run his mill for him. And one of them was a Mr. Foster, later on, who actually became the owner of the mill. I think it was in the mid-1890s. And Mr. Foster owned the mill for a few years, and in 1900, 1901, something like that, it was sold to Tom Wilson family, and we'll hear more about from that point on from Skip. Now, at the lock here, just down the canal, short distance, and the mill, we can say hello to all you canalers and hoggies. If you know what those terms mean, anybody? Know what that means? Well, those are old terms. A canaler was the person who steered the canal boat and did inside work, quote unquote. The hoggy was the mule driver who handled the tow lines and the lock gates. So you had the canal boat, you had a captain and a canaler and a hoggy. Who else? I'm not sure, but you probably had other people that were like sailors on the ship. Well, they had a crew. Now, at this point, I will digress a moment. One of the old captains of these canal boats, not sure if he was from around here, but his name was Pearl Nye, N-Y-E. And he was one of these people that, not just a canal boat captain, he was born in 1872. And he had a family boat docked at Chillicothe, so that's south of here. So he's probably not from around here, but he was also a musician and a songwriter. He wrote dozens of old canal songs. Because, you're sailing down the canal, and the speed limit was 4 miles an hour. So you had lots of time on your hands, and he spent the time composing canal songs. And here's one. This is one of his personal favorites. There are 80 verses to this. But we're not going to sing all. But this is kind of how it would sound. There's a little silver ribbon runs across across the Buckeye State. 'Tis the dearest place of all this earth to me, for upon this placid surface I was born some years ago, and its beauty, grandeur always do I see. And he has several verses, one of which is, Cleveland is the northern end, and Portsmouth is the south, while its side cuts they are many, many palace. These are addressing some friend of his. And where'er we went, we took along our home, sweet home, you know, in those balmy days upon the old canal, etc. 80 verses. But this, thank you. Anyway, Lynn wanted me to share that with you as just a little bit of a sidelight, because obviously these people, they were human beings like us, and they weren't just wooden figures on a canal boat. They did things other than driving a canal boat. Well, loading and unloading freight and passengers took place at the locks. And Skip might tell you something about the lock too, but if you're not familiar with a lock, of course, locks were what prevented the canal from turning into just an ordinary rapid or something, because it would go up or down in the landscape. So locks enabled the boat to travel up or down, depending on the lay of the land. You had 2 gates, certain distance, and it had the lock itself had to accommodate a canal boat, so it was pretty long, and there were gates at either end. So you would open the gate at one end, let the water level come up to the next, or down, up or down to the next level of the water, and then open the other gate, and boat goes sailing on at 4 miles an hour. It had a little, each gate had a little door in it too, that you could open. I'm not sure how that operated, but it was just like a little pet door, and that to relieve pressure so that you could open the gate. Now the Alexander Mill in 1896. Andrews, and this was a year after Andrew, this is the original builder of the mill, died in 1895. His great-nephew, Charles Alexander, brought a load of corn and his 6-year-old daughter, Ethel. Now, jump ahead to 1970. This would make Ethel about 76. Or no, wait a minute, almost 80 years old. Ethel recalled that day, 1970, quote, "The building shook with the rumble of belts and machinery. The miller's cap, beard, and clothes were covered with dust." What the dust actually might have been flour dust or something. But anyway, Ethel described, and unquote, Ethel described, south of the mill was a small grocery saloon. Now, this is another show and tell, which will, Lynn wanted me to give to Skip for their collection, and he has said, yes, we'll hang it up. This is a picture, passing around, hopefully most of you will be able to see it. It's probably kind of dark. You'll see in that picture, also there's another, a version of that photograph in the display back here, taken in around 1924. This picture that we're passing around, if you can see it, is a painting done from memory in about 1920 of the mill around the year of 1900, about the time that the Wilson family acquired it. And it shows a small building just behind. The orientation of that picture is you're standing and looking kind of south at the mill and this building. And it does show this building in this photograph back here. That was kind of a rest stop for the canal boaters. They could have a drink, they could smoke if they wanted to, I suppose, or they could buy supplies and so forth. Another thing that I have that I will, that the Valley View Historical Society will receive is a business card from a N.W. Bolton, who was one of the millers at the Alexander Mill. This is his business card. You probably can't see it too well, but it's a pretty large card. It's larger than most business cards are today, but he has here N.W. Bolton Miller, A. Alexander and Son Flouring Mills, and Bedford, Ohio, and Independence, Ohio. And this card would date probably from the late 1800s. Lynn has told me that she personally knows the great-grandson of this Mr. Bolton. What else we got here? Oh, I should mention too that when Mr. Alexander hired people to be his millers, he also built them a house across from the mill. So the mill was down here, across from the mill was a house, and that was the miller's house. And someone else has told me that even before the Alexander Mill was here, there was a lot of, as you know, already know, as you've heard, there were a lot of farms in this area. So there was a Gleason farm. And the building that we're in now, which dates from about 1905, was one of the Gleason farms. There were several farms and many Gleasons in the area. They were huge landowners. Also, there was a family by the name of Tate, I think, T-A-T-E, and lots of others. This area has been a force in the agriculture of the region for a long time. And as you also heard, the canal began about 1827, it was built, and by the 1830s, it was a going concern. But unfortunately, for all that work that was done to dig the canal by hand, using horses, oxen, Irishmen and Germans, and whoever else was able to do it, with their shovels and picks and so forth, and to actually do all that work from Cleveland to the Ohio River, pretty much, it didn't really last too long. By the 1850s, the railroads were already cutting into their business, and by the Great Flood of 1913, which pretty much washed out any of the rest of it, and the railroads had already taken over by that time anyway. So we're looking at a period of history which is nostalgic, you could say. But the Wilson feed mill, even though it's not part of the canal industry anymore as such, is, and Skip will take it from about 1900, still a very familiar part of our own experience. Now, the state of Ohio owns the canal land, and it still does. they had a rule that if you had build a mill, you leased that land from the state. But later, the Andrew Alexander was allowed to purchase the parcel that he was leasing from the state, so he owned it. And later, the Wilsons owned it. By 1877, the Alexanders had made improvements. Now, Skip's going to talk about different dates, but I know it's sometime in the 1870s. It might have been earlier than that. What used to be a wooden wheel was replaced by 3 vertical turbines, and also the sandstone grinding wheels were replaced by the more efficient roller mills. And as Lynn has it, in 1894, the year before his death, Alexander sold the mill to one of his resident millers, George Foster, and he kept the title Alexander Mills until about 1900, when Foster sold to Tom Wilson. And that's where we will end our presentation. And now Skip Wilson, who is in the family and runs them all, he'll talk about that. He's going to pick it up from here.
Forgive me, I'm going to put together a whole slide presentation, probably a book one day, because to gather all the stuff I thought I knew about our family, I only started scratching the surface of all the pictures and the little dates and details. So I'll leave you my email, or you can bug me, come down at the mill, I'll get your information, and when I finally get some of this stuff together, I'll shoot it out to you. But going back to the water leases, the state originally owns all the water rights within an area, and they had to maintain, though, that there would not be a period of more than 7 days without water for mills. Now, if you went back into the early turn of probably the 20th century, there was probably still maybe 1,100, 1,200 mills, grist mills, water powered, still in the state of Ohio. According to the Society for Preservation of Old Mills, that's SPOOM, not Spoon, there's basically a couple dozen, and we don't even use the water. Dad stopped that about 1970. And for those old enough to remember how wonderful the water conditions were, there was a reason why. So let's take a little trip down memory lane. There we go. I don't have it set up on any, you have to switch it manually. This is one of those famous pictures we've already seen it at least once tonight, circa 1890. And as you can see there, all it's standing really is just the original mill building. As the caption read on the thing I thought I saw from the Historical Society I pulled it from, this was basically a pleasure cruise down to Akron. Let me get the next one. Now, this doesn't look familiar to anyone. Let's go back even further than when the Wilsons came to the valley. This is a picture of the Cataract Mills. It was taken July 29, 1890. The Cataract Mills at Webb Terrace over by the mill stream. If you've ever been there, that's somehow or another, it seems if you're a Wilson, you're going to have mill dust behind your ears and between your toes. That would have been my great-grandfather, Thomas R., and possibly his father before him. And the next picture is one we actually have hanging at the mill, an actual picture. Not one of our best copies to make of it, but we did. And this was before the state and the railroad came through up there and repositioned the creek bed. So where it's at now makes a wonderful picture, but it was actually several hundred feet in the other direction. Go on to the next one. Now, I'm not quite so sure if this is down by the visitor center or if that's up just past us, because I can't quite see what's right around the corner. That could be like, 37, it might not be, but there you go. Not horsepower, but wheel power. And for those who've never heard the saying, when she's got a rear end on her like a $20 mule, well, back in those days, a $20 mule was something. There is a book out, literally, it says the phrases my grandfather used and what they mean, so you don't get smacked. But yes, they had the teams of mules, and many times those would go from literally lock to lock or station to station, and they would give them a rest and move on to the next. No, next week. This is I got this backwards. This is actually a surveyor thing of what the actual falls look like and where my great-grandfather and his dad probably had the mill up in what would have been Newburgh. And by the way, Newburgh Heights at one time was bigger than the city of Cleveland. Before the Civil War, it was a much bigger burg, literally. And then the foundry started down in the lakeshore. Go to the next one. One of the most famous pictures of my grandfather, I can close my eyes and see him. That probably goes back well into the 30s, or about the 40s, or maybe early 50s. And he wore the same khaki work clothes until he had his stroke. And I can remember Dad yelling at the employees because Grandpa was getting older and he'd still sneak out and grab a bag of feed. And Dad had strict orders, don't let him carry anything. And of course, they told Dad, we can't watch him all the time, Tommy. So, but most of the apparatus and things, if you find a day you want to come down and visit, particularly a rainy day, give a call. I'll be happy to get you in the cobwebs and show you some of the original dust. But that was one of my favorites, my grandfather. That brings back some sentimental feelings. Next one. Now, Lock 37, this is one of the pictures that I've got a couple of them from like two angles. Of course, the mill is right across the way here. Was this possibly, I don't know if that was the one that Alexander built, but this is also where they would have the teams of horses, and this would be the stop along the way. The irony of it is I think that second building, part of it on the backside, my grandfather took it down the top of it, and it's now the garage sitting behind what used to be their house, and now belongs to my sister and her husband, Ross. So, needless to say, history got moved across the street. But you can see here we have almost, what was it, from the Velociter, the name for the early cars before they called them automobiles. So we know we're in the early 20th century there, but you can still see we do have some pictures I've got to put together that actually show horse and buggy. And the guy standing there, you can tell he doesn't belong. Who doesn't belong in this picture? One appears to be my grandfather or great-grandfather. The other appears to be George Johnson Sr. That's Martin and Paul's grandfather. And then the guy standing there in a straw hat with white shirt and suspenders. So if you look at that one and you go, which one doesn't belong, you can tell the salesman or whatever he was. Next picture, I think, is also, this is coming, headed north. And again, what's attached to the mill. It says Vanacek family built a tavern, general storehouse, and barn. So you're looking at a picture painted of what used to be there. So let's advance a little bit more. That's what we look like from across the lock now. If you get a chance to, I don't know what the park will let you do, but they're working on the sluice gate there right now, and you can actually see part of where they had the hydraulic works built into the lock, so when they wanted to let water in or out of the locks besides the opening of the gates, you can see there's holes in there. And it's rather fascinating. Of course, I don't think there's enough to probably event tape to keep you out but, sneak in anyways. You live here, you're tax dollars. Mine too. And that was a picture from basically out of the, much earlier in the 20th century. You can see the size of the ball spots here. And if you were to be able to stand on top of right here and look at the building, you would have seen that there's an archway built into the building, and that's where the water would come out. And on this side facing Canal Road is a small arch. That's where the water would have been in the exhaust. Now, what's wonderful about that picture, and this is why I had to put the disclaimer in, There was no water wheel for most anybody alive here. How many of us remember the world's biggest bubble bath we ever seen? Somebody up in Cuyahoga Falls or Akron would dump some detergent in it and the foam just rolled over the road. As a kid, I thought that was one of the coolest things until Dad says, yeah, well, told me what they were doing. But yes, that was the world's biggest bubble bath, and I, to this day, still love the number of people that come into the store and say, my dad or my uncle took me down there, and I remember all the bubbles. So the next slide. I should have blown this one up a little bit more, but another picture of Grandpa in his khakis. And we can see by if you can see the dress, it's probably 40 or 50-ish. Everything down there was done by hand. You know, it's funny because my father and my grandfather all had what we called our lost boys. We all had a group of younger guys with strong backs and empty wallets that would work and do the work just to make sure they could pay for their vices and entertainment. And I can already tell you the exact position my grandfather was in when the shipment carried stuff. He had the bag up here and he had his hand like this, and it seemed like he always walked with a never-ending angle. And now at 52, I understand what that is, and that's why youngsters carry stuff for me, and I can eat it. As we all know, getting out of bed so now is becoming more and more of a, deal. Let's look at the history just a little bit here since we stopped. This is a picture of Paul's box. You can see one of the turbines, if you were to look at the place on where the white is, we blocked it in. Simply because when there's no water in, the raccoons think this is a drive-through. And the dog food, and they don't go to the same bag they broke the night before. They constantly have to find a new one. So, when about to the late 80s, the wooden part of the structure, because it was no longer kept wet, lost its ability to be sound, and the one good flood blew out the front and side. So, at that time, my brother Todd and some guys who knew what the cement, they put in a base there. We were hoping one day to eventually be able to put wood on top of it, at least to give it some representation. But back in those days, it was the roller mills. We were starting to see hammer mills and corn crackers. And what wasn't happening necessarily on the canal was happening from local farmers. So you would see the grains come in, and you'd see them being, ground, broken, processed. You know, there's different ways to prepare oats, different ways to do corn. And Grandpa even started mixing some of it. And by the time, each and every one of us seems to have faced a new task when the generations change and society changes. In his day, it was a lot of that, and also at one time he bragged he had the best bread flour in northern Ohio when he got his new hammer mills in. Now, he also, during the Depression time, ground up glass. We were doing some rummaging and found what looked like a big hat box. We opened it up, it's like, please, nobody get your head over the top of it and breathe it. That would be bad news, and I really hate to think what it would have done to our lungs, but it came down to doing whatever needed to help pay the bills, and if it was making an extra dollar and helping someone out, that probably would have been my grandfather. His style of his business was primarily agriculture, farming. As it started to go on, we did have some relatively large farms around. And at one time there was maybe as many as 600 head of cattle, and I forget how many thousand chickens. The feed came out of the mill. I came in working there legally, and before then, seeing all the bags of layer mash. And it was grind it up, mix it up, put it on the truck. And of course, working alongside my grandfather at that time, off and on, was his brother Charles, or Charlie, or Babe, whichever you knew him by. My grandfather was a stoic, good Christian man. My great uncle was a little more mischievous. And if anybody got a chance to know him, he was a genuine article. Love the guy. True story, and since for all adults here. He used to sneak into the mill sometimes, pick up the phone, dial his wife, and breathe heavy on the phone. He was in his 60s, late 60s, when he was doing it. So you can see that family was just a little bit different on some of the things that were, how they did things. And that was where, the house across the street was where Chuck, Bob, Lois, and Janet were born. In fact, the place at times that Uncle Charlie would go to work and Aunt Hazel would make sure the boys got hid up in the attic and they didn't go to school. And before the road was moved, when you saw that, it used to be a really nice farm up on top of the plateau there. So we'll save the grease pig and other stories for later. So when you see what's left here, Grandpa still used the water power. Dad started using more electricity in the 60s and took one good flood with a lot of silt and a lot of junk in there and said, forget it. And very much like the young lady that wrote the article that you were presenting a little earlier, anybody can remember going in there, the place had its own sway. Because everything inside of it was being used with belts and shafts, so there was always something there that was, you know. The next slide, if you could. Most of this stuff is still there, by the way. It's collecting cobwebs, and we are not so sure with our Greenwood Park will have to be moved. But if you could think of how you get electric or power from one place to the next, this was basically backyard physics. Everything was gears and loops and belts and shafts, and I wish I had a picture of it. We actually have some of the wheels that actually have wooden teeth in them. Because the last thing you wanted to do was probably then get a piece of 8-foot shaft. It'd be easier just to insert a new tooth when it chipped off when everything seized. Go to the next one. A little more of a close-up. And yes, it's still just about that dusty. Yes, we get a truckload of shell corn in. There is hill dust on everybody and everything. So if you come in and want to buy a bird feeder and it's dusty, no, it's not been there since Hector was a pup. We just got corn in and haven't had a chance to run a rag on everything. Now, the fifth grain up into the top of the elevator, originally it was probably water power. This would have been an indoor leg, grain leg or an elevator. That's basically nothing more than a canvas belt with scoops on it. And grain is dumped into an auger outside the parking lot, and we run it up through the grain leg and then through a series of tubes or shafts or wooden boxes. And it goes to whatever bin we want it to. Again, another good picture of all this. I wish you knew what it was all attached to at one time. Because as most of us realized, when we had a chance to ask questions, write it all down, we didn't because we were young. And, you know, to walk through there when I met the park guys up there and some of the people from these historical societies, they actually drool over themselves to see. In fact, one of them even was looking at the window glass and knew all about how the window glass and what period it was. I'm amazed that, I walk in there 6 days a week and I love it, but, it's so part of the job. I'm not going around looking to see, that hinge up there looks, but most of that workings are still there. There's a couple in the basement. We still have some of the crackers and grinders that we used to use, and most of that has gone the way of the dinosaur only because there's no real demand for that type of product anymore, and it's easier for us, in most cases, to buy it already pre-mixed. Move on to the next. The back room, I should have ballooned this one up a little bit more. I was in a hurry. Each of those are steel bins we put grain in. We mix a lot of our own bird seed before it became too big for us. The truck would show up and dump it in that same grain leg up that silver set of tubes or rectangular things you see in the parking lot on the south side of the mill. That goes up and it's positioned out into the bins. And some things there are still done manually. We take that big steel cart, which probably weighs third of a ton, and you put another 300 or 400 pounds of grain in it, and push it up to a couple of mixers that are now about 70 years old, and still makes their daily. Dad got to looking at how things were changing, because coming out of the Army in the late 50s, and then me and Grandpa made a transition, I heard rather roughly during the 60s. He started to see that it wasn't going to be just grinding, it was going to be more of the other things, that civilization was getting a lot closer. You know, we can look at this village and realize exactly how wild it was not too long ago. You know, you were a long ways from Cleveland. George Johnson used to tell me the stories about when his dad remembers two cars coming in past this way every morning, and the same two coming back every night. You know, it wasn't a big thoroughfare and like Canal Road is now. So his went to a little bit more of the mixing and the feeds, and then of course after that becomes suburbia and gardens, so it was fertilizer. And of course with fertilizer there was also things like peat moss. One of our great duties as kids was Dad would have the guys take a flatbed over to where the railroad yard is right now. There'd be a boxcar load of peat moss, wet, slimy, part of Canada's finest. And the guys would put them on the truck, and then we bring them over to the mill, and then we hand stack them back up there. Young men that work for us now don't like the idea hearing that they used to hand stack the fertilizer probably 10 to 15 feet high. And it were 50-pound bags, they were 80-pound bags at the time. So, yes, you were the tougher generation. I'm hopefully going to be the smarter generation. So when we did start there, that's when we started shifting over more to bird seeds, lawn and garden things. And now, and pet foods, for a long time, were a big stay until every Walmart, Kmart, Target, Marks, Petco, Pet Supplies Plus, PetSmart, and all the rest of them started carrying. But I still do have a good product if you want to feed your pooch. Good stuff. You just gotta know how to read the label, and we'll be happy to help you. That was an unabashedly ashamed plug. And we do have the best bird seed out there. That was the last of my, pop it up there, Dave, I got one last. This is part of the transition, I pulled it out of there. It's actually an encyclopedia of Cleveland history. It says the Wilson Feed Mill, originally built and operated as gristmill by Andrew and Robert Alexander in 1855, following the construction of Highway Canal in 1827. The grain and feed industry in the Western Reserve grew exponentially, able to be more easily ship their products along the canal, and canal gristmill owners like the Alexanders had access to larger markets for the product. The mill was built in present-day Valley View, Block 37, and the rest. So that's really your dates, the main dates. It did shift around. It was late 1900 when they actually signed the papers, but for all intents and purposes, it's been in the family since 1901. So if you think about that, my great-grandfather is generation 1, grandpa 2, dad 3, me and my family's siblings 4, and our kids are 5. So it's been a family thing around here, just like all the other names we hear in our wonderful history. Just one little thing to share, so you, the family members of our community, the National Park Service was given the land and water rights by the state some years ago. It used to be a real cheap, real easy deal. Shoot a check for about $200 a year down to Columbus, and it was taken care of. We had another year or whatever. I think they did 5-year increments. When the state deeded it over to the National Park Service, the National Park Service Department of Interior does not honor the other's contracts or agreements. So we're sitting here looking at literally a stalemate of sorts and a crossroads. Whereas the park owns part of most of the land we sit on, but they don't own parts that the mill kind of sits on, nor the building. So, to go through the whole process of trying to figure, and by the way, lawyers and surveyors love this whole thing because you remember when they moved the road? Can we have a picture of them? The road was moved. Well, that uncovered boundary lines that nobody knew was there because it was up on top of the hill between Johnson's and Wilson's and whomever. Now they have to figure out. Now they have to figure out what belonged to whom and where was it and why is it Marty and Paul are using part of the land that was on the Wilson side, and why do we have part of our parking lot that belongs to Paul at the Johnson farm? And oh, by the way, then we start with everything that ran up to Old Adolph's gas station, for those that remember that. And that's a whole other piece of local color that we needed to have. So, long story short, we entered into an agreement this last spring with them that they have taken title of the building and the land and giving us a 40-year rent-free lease with the possibility of renegotiating 35, 40 years down the road. They hold all the cards, but this is the best opportunity for the family to keep what was going. Besides, it belongs to everybody who walks through the door. It just doesn't belong to us. I wish I had a dime for every time I heard someone say I used to come down here with Phil and grandmother, grandfather, dad, uncle, whatever. It's not just about a business and making money. It's part of what is here in Valley View. So if you hear any more rumors about it, we finally put to rest all of the, let's see, when did Sarver Lane put that through Congress? In 1976, I think it was. So for 40 years we've been hearing, oh, I hear the park's taking you. That's really good. I haven't been spoken to anybody. So needless to say, that is where things now stand. So don't expect anything to change. They want to be good landlords. They know that messing with anything that looks like an institution like our store and business and its legacy would be very bad publicity. So in this day of social media, I would not even have to say a word. The uproar would probably hit Omaha real quick. So we've developed a real good working relationship with them, even though if you have any dealings with the National Park Service, you know it is a tedious process. So now what does that mean with Wilson Feed Mill? We actually did something we haven't done in a long time. My sisters decided they want to open up until 7 on Wednesdays. Open at night? What? That's never happened. This must be a sign of the apocalypse. And Grandpa wanted to make sure he had his day off. Dad did too. They want to open up for a little bit on Sundays just to make sure we surprise a number of folks that can't make it. Still drive by and don't know what it is. So, that's just a little bit of what the history has gone to, how we've transitioned. It seems like next generation of Wilsons will have to figure out what the market works for them and how things will work out. If I can answer any questions, you can quiz me here or take me aside. I will be putting together a kind of like a PowerPoint presentation like this, or see if I can put it onto a CD. That way you can see a lot of the different pictures, because we've got, just like the one that's been donated, we've got half a dozen of them that were hand painted that are phenomenal in the store. And pictures of things that go back. We even have an ad when, let's see, was it a white or was it a Dodge truck? Had to be back in the late 40s, right around 1950. They used one of our trucks in an ad. So it just, if you're nostalgic and you're sentimental old fool like I am, we'll get it out to you. You can take a look and remember what you remember. I thank you for your patience, and actually, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, or if you can come down and out of the floor. No mic drop. Hi, Sue. We'll get out of the way here.
I just wanted to thank you all for coming. We definitely want to thank all of our speakers. They did a wonderful job for us tonight. I think we all learned a little bit about history. We all know these little pieces of histories and those little pieces of histories, but these folks tie it all together for us. We hope to continue this, and there'll be, the next time will be our 3rd annual Red Barn event. So please be very careful walking out. If you need a water, you can take them on your way out, and have a safe trip home. And thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.